are some things that stood out, Luke?
When Jacob got the wrestle with God.
Yeah, Jacob wrestling with God. That's a pretty big thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
And what happened as a result of that?
He just hit like off or something.
Yeah, and the rest of his life he had a limp from that. Bill?
I just thought it was cool how Joseph got so much power from like being a prisoner and then being second in command.
Yeah, from about the lowest place you could be in prison to being second in command in all of Egypt. Now, it took a while, some years. Sometimes we read things in the Bible, we think it just happened in a couple of days, but it was a lot of years. He went through a lot of suffering, but God blessed him, didn't he? Robbie?
When Jacob finally met Esau after Esau tried to kill him, and how happy Esau was.
Yeah, so Esau had a different attitude than what Jacob thought he might have, right? He was basically forgiving. Sophie?
I thought it was interesting how there was a lot of favoritism. Like Esau was a favorite, and then Joseph was a favorite. And then we learned that caused a lot of problems.
Yeah, favoritism causes problems, doesn't it? I'm sure that doesn't happen in any of your houses. I won't ask you to share, but it can. Joel?
I actually have a question. At the end of chapter 50, it says, so Jesus died, or Joseph died, being 110 years old. They embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. Does that mean he was like,
So he was mummified.
he was mummified?
Yeah.
Was he put somewhere special? Or?
Well, we're going to actually find that out today.
Okay.
All right? So that would be a good lead-in if it was the last statement. but Brenna has something she wants to say, so we'll do that first.
I didn't realize that the tribe of Jacob wasn't just Rachel and Leah's children. I didn't realize all the female servants and stuff.
Yeah, so the mothers of the 12 sons weren't just Rachel and Leah, they were also concubines that were mothers. Yeah. Anything else stood out to you? Okay, those are some pretty important things. Let's go back to Joel's question. And we want to look at today is concerning what Joseph does in Egypt. Remember, of course, that Joseph had been sold to a caravan and brought down into Egypt, where he served Potiphar, was thrown in jail on false charges, eventually was brought out of jail to interpret dreams for Pharaoh, and as a result of that was made vizier of the entire kingdom of Egypt. And one of the goals that there was for him was to accumulate grain in the 7 years of plenty so that they would have enough to eat during the 7 years of famine. I don't know if I told you yesterday or not, but Joseph really had two titles. He had the title of vizier, running the affairs of Egypt, but also the title of the one in charge of the granaries. So that was a very important job because grain was an extremely important part of not only the economy of Egypt, but just the life of Egypt as well. All right, so Joseph's task is to build storehouses where he can store all this grain that they're accumulating during the good years, right? So what do you think what are the two issues? I've already mentioned one. Well, one issue is making sure they have enough grain to last for the 7 years of famine. What would be another issue if there's going to be a famine? What else would they need? Water. Good. And we're going to see how Joseph provided that. Now, before I went to Egypt, I did not know, none of my Bible teachers in college or seminary ever told me that there was actually evidence in Egypt of Joseph's storehouses. I never knew that. But there is. This is where he built the storehouses, in a place called Fayum. This is a pyramid built there at the storehouses. We'll look more carefully at that in a moment. Here's some of the guards that were there, making sure that we weren't attacked by terrorists. Because this is out away from the city. On our way out there in our bus, there was a pickup truck in front of us in which there were armed guards in the pickup truck with submachine guns that look like, or AK-47, something like that. And when we got there, they went in first and alerted the guards that are stationed there all the time that there's a group coming in, and they immediately sent some of them out to hillsides around to watch to make sure that no terrorist groups were coming in to attack us. So a little bit freaky for that to happen. But it was because a few years before that, a terrorist group had attacked a busload of German tourists and killed a bunch of them. So they're careful. But these guys are just out there all day long, just waiting, and hardly anybody goes out here. Hardly anybody knows about this, I guess, among tourist groups, or most tourists aren't interested, I suppose. But being that we're a tour of Bible-believing Christians, they thought this would be something we'd be interested in. So we went out there. Here's again a closer look at the pyramid of Joseph's storehouse. Now, since Joseph was in charge of this area, he built the storehouses here, as we'll see, and there's a pyramid there. Now, what's the purpose of a pyramid? To bury someone. Now, since this is Joseph's area, what logical assumption might we come to about the pyramid that's there? Probably for Joseph. You know, his burial place wouldn't be where the pharaohs were, because that would be putting him in too high of a place. But certainly out here where he was in charge, that would be a logical thing. So Joel's question, where was he buried? I think he was buried right there. Here's another look from the other side. You see a lot of sand has come in, a lot of rocks have fallen off. You'll see another picture of the opening later. Now, this is where all the storehouses were. These piles, the storehouses themselves have long ago fallen down, but they left an area that people can tell, the archaeologists can tell, okay, here's where a storehouse was, and they're indicated by all these out here. So these were all, I assume, kind of like silos, maybe, or some kind of building that they just put grain in. And remember, this is over 3,000 years ago. So the fact that there's anything there at all is remarkable.
Have people gone into Joseph's, well, supposedly Joseph's tomb and found anything?
It's empty. Remember, number one, any tombs in Egypt that are at all visible have been emptied hundreds and hundreds of years ago. Robbers came in and took everything. The exception of that is King Tut's tomb, because it was covered with sand and nobody knew it was there until late 1800s it was. So in the first place, there would be nothing there. Secondly, remember when the children of Israel left Egypt with Moses, they took the body of Joseph with them. Is that your next question?
No, but I was going to say, why would robbers steal bodies?
Well, yeah, they wouldn't, except if they thought there was something. Oh, the other thing that happened, remember in the video we saw that after Napoleon had come into Egypt and it became popular in Europe to think about, they grew up this, there was this myth that if you took mummies and ground them up into little bits and drank it, did things that somehow that would be healthy. So at that time, they were looking for mummies, and they would get mummies and grind them up and send them back to Europe, and people were putting in their drinks or whatever to maybe rubbing it on themselves. I'm not sure what they were doing, but somehow they thought it had some kind of magical use. So many of the mummies disappeared because of that.
Do people with a secular worldview, do they believe that is Joseph's?
Well, I'll tell you, the people who live there know it is, because they call it Joseph's storehouses. We're going to see some other evidences too. I have a feeling that for the most part, secular historians kind of ignore it. Like I said, I've never read about it in any history book I ever read. So I'm not sure what the exact answer is. Caden?
When they wrapped the mummies and put them in the tomb, you know how they left the heart?
Yeah.
If robbers came around No, they ground up. What would they do? What would they do?
I don't even know how they ground them up. Did they have a meat grinder? They just stuck the moving? I don't know. I don't know how they did it or what they did exactly. It's just kind of a gruesome thing to even think about. So I don't know.
With the seculars, they probably like lie about it because like I had friends in Catholic schools. They said that they were talking about the Reformation and just like how it was like Christian rule and stuff. And they're talking about how Martin Luther was like evil-minded and he started slavery in the Reformation. So like it's just lying.
Yeah. So you find that too. Mostly, I think they just ignore this. Here, more collapsed storehouse. You can see some of the stone remains, possibly. Here's the pyramid again, mostly covered with sand on this side. They're doing excavations there right now. They found a building. They're reconstructing the walls of this building, and here's a bunch of pottery that they found laying around. They're trying to categorize it. Closer look at pottery. And this is really interesting. That is a statue. Well, the remains. You know, the head's gone, the bottom part's gone, so basically it's the chest of the statue. And again, you think, okay, whose statue would be there? Well, you might say it might be the Pharaoh statue. That would make sense. But our guy Midu pointed out that the necklace that's on here is not a Pharaoh necklace. And we know from history that the Pharaoh did give a gold necklace to Joseph. And so this quite possibly is a statue of Joseph. Too bad we don't have the head, so we don't know what he looked like, except that the statue is there. Here is the possible burial place then of Joseph. Here's the opening into the pyramid that's there. Now, it was mentioned that not only would he have to store grain, well, let's not get at that yet. In order to get the grain there, how would he accomplish that? How would he get the grain from where it's growing to there? This is a dry area where we were, and far enough away from the Nile that when the Nile flooded, it wouldn't flood this. Because what if the Nile flooded where you had all the grain stored?
Wash away.
Yeah, wash away. It would make it rot, right? So you have to be far enough away from the Nile. But then how would you get the grain to this place? What plan would you come up with? How would you get the grain from, let's say, the Nile River area where it's grown up to the storehouse at Fayum? What might you do?
I mean, the wheel and axle was already invented, so like it's just
Okay, you use carts, wagons. Anybody know an easier way to move large amounts of materials? How about by water? But there's no water there. So he built a canal. There's a canal that runs right up to the storehouse area. It's still there, that Joseph built, because it's a lot easier to transport all that by boat than it is by wagon. So there's the canal. Now, the other thing was mentioned that you need to store up is water, because during a famine, that probably means the Nile is not overflowing, and therefore you don't have a lot of water either. Joseph took care of that. He found a depressed area of land near the Nile River and dug a canal from the Nile River over to this area and simply flooded it with water. And it's still there today. And it's called Joseph's Lake among the Arabs that lived there. Here it is from, or Lake Karam is an Arabic name for it, but commonly they call it Joseph's Lake. Here's the lake from space. Probably at one time it would have been all this area, because here's the canal coming in. And near the area where the storehouses were. Here's the Nile Valley. Here's the Nile River. Here's the Nile Valley over here. Here's the lake today. Even what's there today is pretty big. Right?
Was the famine for 7 years?
Yes. So he stored up all the water they needed in this lake. Now the problem is there is no outlet from the lake. So you know what happens to a lake if water comes in but never leaves? It gets dirty, it gets minerals, because the water evaporates and leaves behind the minerals, so it becomes very mineral laden, salty. That's what the Dead Sea is. This is not quite to that point. I think there may be some fishing here still, but it's to the point where the Egyptian government is thinking about just draining it and not having it there at all. Okay.
Did God create that lake?
No, Joseph created it.
So how long did it take them to take?
Well, like I said, he found an area that was already depressed, an area of land, so he didn't have to dig anything out. It was already lower. He just had to dig a canal from the Nile River to that and let the water flow in. Okay. So, I mean, really good evidence for what Joseph did, and maybe even helps us understand, because all we read in the Bible is that basically he provided, but we don't know what he did. But here we have the exact things that he accomplished. All right, so Joseph's families, as we know, went to Goshen due to a famine before. In Canaan, they're living in the land of Goshen. Following Joseph's storing up of grain, I'm sorry, not the famine, this is the famine that occurs during the time of Joseph. Remember, his family comes down to get grain because Egypt has grain, because Joseph made sure they did. And you know how his family came then to live in the land of Goshen, which was the best land in Egypt, in the Delta area. Here are some pictures. We did not go there, so these are just pictures I found. Even today, it's still a pretty lush land. There's some evidence that during this time, Pharaoh allowed there to be kings over different areas of Egypt. And there seems to be evidence that there was a king over the land of Goshen whose name was Jacob. In fact, some scarabs have even been found with his name on it. A scarab is one of these. It's a sacred item in Egypt. It's simply a dung beetle. If you had Mrs. Henry first grade, you learned about dung beetles, right? They push the big ball of elephant dung along, they lay eggs in it, and the beetles that are born eat from that, grow. But it was an important figure. We'll learn more about that later to look at the Egyptian gods. But they found some of these with Jacob's name. So very interesting how some of that fits together with what we see in the Bible. It gives us even more information than what we have there. All right, any questions about anything we talked about concerning Joseph and the Middle Kingdom? All right, we're going to leave the Middle Kingdom now. Probably the most important things we can remember is that it was a time of great prosperity for Egypt and a time when Joseph came and saved Egypt from famine. And of course, God was behind that whole thing because it also saved Israel and his children. All right, so leaving the Middle Kingdom, then we go to an intermediate kingdom, intermediate time again. This is a time when Pharaoh loses power, when there's division in the country, and so what that does is that it leads to a vulnerability to people coming from outside. And so what happens is these people called the Hyksos invade Egypt. They were called the Hyksos by the Egyptians. The word Hyksos means foreign chiefs. So they said these foreign chiefs came in and took over Egypt. In reality, they were a ruling class of Semitics from Syria, Palestine, and were largely Amorites. All right, now first of all, let's talk about it. Semitics. Semitics means that they are descendants of who? No, not Semitics. Those would be Hamites if they're descendants of Ham. Who are the Semitics? They're descendants of Shem. And who else is a descendant of Shem?
Nimrod?
No. I think he was Ham. All right, well, never mind. We'll get back to that. They were ruling in Syria, Palestine. If you look at this map over here, Syria, Palestine is generally this area here is Syria. Palestine is the land of Canaan. So the Amorites were ruling here, and then they invaded Egypt. Now, we have come across the Amorites previously. Where do we see the Amorites before? What area did the Amorites take over before?
Didn't they take over Egypt before?
No? Yes, or Babylon. Remember, the old Babylonian kingdom was Amorites. The Amorites had come in and taken over from Hamites that lived there. And remember, it's from then, when the Amorites were there, that who was called to follow God? Abraham. Abram was an Amorite, remember? But then he becomes the father of the Hebrew people, which become a separate people, but they're related to the Amorites. That's what Abram was. So these Amorites, who had once taken over this area, spread out, took over this area, and now they're expanding down into Egypt and have taken over Egypt. They established a capital at Avaris, which is just a different city than what normally was used, and it's up in the north in Lower Egypt. Now, interesting, when you look at the names of some of the rulers, some of their names are names like this. Somebody like to pronounce that? Try to pronounce that. Go ahead, Jaden. Caden. I can only call you Jaden for some reason. Caden.
Yaakov.
Yeah, say it faster.
Yaakov.
Okay, what does that sound like? Sounds like Jacob. In fact, in Hebrew, a lot more, because there is no J in Hebrew. In Hebrew, it's a Yaakov, and this is Yaakov. So the names are even similar. So they're relatives of the Hebrews, these Amorites that come in and take over. One thing they brought with them was using chariots in warfare. That's something the Egyptians had not done. Now, one of the criticisms that some people make of the Bible who are looking for problems is that they say, well, in Genesis it says that there were chariots before these guys came in. Well, my solution is maybe there were chariots, but they just weren't used for war. It was the Hyksos who used it for war. Or it may be that the Egyptians had carts that they rode in, and as Moses is writing the book of Genesis, he assigns it a word chariot, but by that he simply means a wheeled cart. So I think there are logical explanations for why chariots appear in the Bible record before they appear in the secular history record. And so I don't think we need to throw out the Bible just because there's a difficulty there. But the Hyksos brought in the idea of chariot warfare, which the Egyptians then would use after this. Here's the area the Hyksos ruled over. You can see it's primarily, as far as Egypt goes, Lower Egypt. They did not come here, these are the other capitals of ancient Egypt. So they're ruling over Lower Egypt, Sinai Peninsula, which was part of Egypt, and then up into Palestine. So they're ruling over quite a large area in the time period that they were there. All right, those are the Hyksos. Now, we found, there's been some things found of theirs. There's a princess crown. Here are some other pieces of pottery and different things that were found belonging to the Hyksos. All right, any questions about the Hyksos? All right, eventually, there's a man who is able to gather up an army and drive out the Hyksos, take over Egypt once again for Egyptians. And his name is Ahmose the First. Ahmose the First drives out the Hyksos and establishes what we call the New Kingdom. This is a new generation of Egyptians that are ruling over Egypt, the New Kingdom. During his reign, central power was established. So once again, all of Egypt is under one central authority, and they have the greatest imperial expansion of any time in Egypt's history. In other words, they conquer more territories outside of Egypt than ever. And he establishes a military state. So in other words, he rules, and he makes sure that you follow his rules because he's got the army behind him. He's got an army that will enforce what he says. Here's a picture looking at his army. Here's a model of the army that was made to put in a tomb. Here are some weapons, and you can see here the height of the empire of course, along the Nile here, down all the way down into Nubia. There's Upper Egypt, Lower Egypt. He conquered up into Palestine, Syria, all the way up into the Hittite territories. And eventually, the empire would extend that far. Okay, let's look at some of the people. Amos the first, we've already said, is the person who drove out the Hyksos and established essentially the new kingdom. Now, the other names follow, and I want you to open your Bibles, if you have them, to take a look at who these people are. Have your Bibles open to Exodus chapter 1. Exodus chapter 1. Look at verse 8. It says, "Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph." All right, who is this? Well, I think that this is talking about Amenhotep I, the son of Amos. Notice the Amen in there. This is the Pharaoh of Exodus 1, 8 to 14. And if you write your Bibles, I hope you write notes in there so that when you look back later, you can remember some things that you've learned. I would write over new king, Amenhotep I. That way you always know who that was. Amenhotep I. All right? So he is the one who did not know Joseph. Why didn't he know Joseph? Well, Joseph had come during the Middle Kingdom period. And then that dynasty died out when the Hyksos came in, took over. When a new kingdom arose, it wasn't the same families that were in charge before. So they did not know what the previous pharaohs had done. So when the new kingdom was established, they knew nothing about Joseph. All they knew is that there are a bunch of relatives of the Amorites living up and down in the delta, down in the land of Goshen. There are people that look just like the enemies we just drove out living there. And what happens? Well, as Amos the first and Amenhotep the first are involved in driving out the Hyksos, they looked around at other Semitic groups, and they either drove them out or enslaved them. So if they saw Semites, they either said, you got to leave, or we're going to make you slaves. And what did they do with the Hebrew people? Made them slaves, right? So that fits in with what happened here under the rule of Amos and Amenhotep I. Amenhotep I then says in verse 9 that he says the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. What was he concerned about? Rebellion. And that would maybe bring back the Hyksos, because they're relatives, they're cousins. So he says they're getting too mighty. We got to do something about this. He says, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out with, well, who's he concerned about war breaking out again? With the Hyksos. They join our enemies and fight against us. Why would they join our enemies? Because they're relatives and escape from the land. So they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built cities, and so on and so on. They made the people of Israel work as slaves, made their lives bitter with hard service, and the description is there. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. All right? That was under Amenhotep I. Now, we come to verse 15, and it says, then indicating some time passed, right? The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, and you know the plan there is to kill all the baby boys, because they're not worried about girls, right? They're not worried about girls fighting against them. Sorry, girls. They're worried about the boys growing up and becoming warriors. So the plan is to get rid of the boys. This is a different king. So above the king of Egypt in verse 15, write Tutmos the first, or Tutmosis sometimes it's spelled. This is the Pharaoh of Exodus 1, 15 to 22. Now, Moses wasn't concerned with writing down exactly who it was. He's just telling us, he just wants us to understand what happened. But looking at history, we can look back and see, here's the Pharaoh that did this, here's the Pharaoh that did this other. And you know what happened with the midwives are supposed to kill the baby boys, and they didn't follow through. And then how there is a mother that gives birth to a baby, and she doesn't want him killed, but she knows that he's crying and Egyptian soldiers might hear him, and so what does she do? Puts him in a basket. She weaves a basket, puts him in it, and puts the basket where?
Moving down the road.
In the Nile River. And then what happens? He's floating in the Nile River, and a crocodile came along and ate him. Is that right, Robbie? No? What happened? What happened, Robbie?
Princess got him.
Princess, Egyptian princess found him and saved him and took him to be her own. But she's a problem. She has not just given birth, so she can't nurse this baby. So now she has to find somebody to nurse him. And who should be nearby but Moses' sister Miriam, who suggests that she knows somebody who can nurse him, which was who? Moses' own mother. So we have this interesting situation where Moses is rescued from the Nile River and is given to his own mother to nurse, and the Egyptian princess pays her to do it. To do what she would have done gladly without anything, right? Then when Moses gets big enough to leave his mother, he is brought by this princess into the palace. Now, I think we can know pretty certainly who this princess was. This was the princess who was the daughter of Thutmose I. Her name is Hatshepsut. And that's her brother, Thutmose II. Brother/husband, because they would get married also.
Okay.
But if it makes you feel better, he's only her half-brother.
Oh, that's all. Just like
I'll explain that in a minute.
Abraham.
I'll explain why they do that, okay? All right, so here's the situation. We have Moses born in slavery to a Hebrew woman, rescued by Princess Hatshepsut, and then raised in Pharaoh's house. Notice he doesn't get his name from his Hebrew parents. Who names him? The princess, Hatshepsut. And she names him not a Hebrew name. Moses is not a Hebrew name. It's an Egyptian word, which means born or born out of. And notice she says, she names him Moses because she got him out of the Nile. He was born out of the Nile. But also notice something else. I didn't realize this until just a couple years ago. Moses. Moses is a family name. So she names him the same name that is running through her royal family. Raises him in the palace. She does not have a natural born son. That means as the princess of Egypt, and actually we'll see she becomes Pharaoh later on, I think she was raising up Moses to replace her. I think Moses was being raised to be Pharaoh after her. But there are going to be some things that are going to intervene that will prevent that. All right, here's some statues and busts that Hatshepsut made of herself as she becomes ruler. When her father dies, she becomes part ruler. We'll talk about that in a moment, but here's just some pictures of her. She makes a sphinx of herself. Here's a statue of herself as king. Here she even puts on a fake beard to show herself as Pharaoh. Here's how that comes about. When Thutmose I died, Thutmose II is his son and should become Pharaoh. The only problem is he is the son of the woman who is not the queen. The person who is the product of the queen is Hatshepsut, along with these other people. So Hatshepsut is the one that has the royal blood in her. So the only way Thutmose II can rule is to marry his half-sister. And then he has the right to rule because now he is connected with royal blood. Do you follow that? Does that make some sense? All right. So they are together. Thutmose is, how should we say, mentally deficient. So Hatshepsut does a lot of the decision making. When he dies, his son Thutmose III is supposed to take over, but Thutmose III is too young. Also, he is the son of another woman who is not the queen. Hatshepsut is the queen. So she rules as kind of the vice regent in his place, and then he's supposed to take over when he gets older. Thing is, she never gives it up. She keeps ruling, which causes a lot of negative feelings for Tutmos toward his stepmother slash aunt, Joel.
Was she the first woman pharaoh?
Yes. The first woman pharaoh.
Do secular like people and stuff like do they say it's okay to have sexual relations outside of marriage and stuff because of like these things?
I don't think there's any relation. People think it's okay to have sex outside of marriage because they want to. They don't have to have an example.
Like do they have it like do they say the Bible contradicts itself in that?
No, because these people weren't even believers in God. You do find believers in God like Abram, Jacob, and you go on further to David, and it's a mystery that God doesn't say much about that. But it kind of has to remain that way. Okay, for tomorrow or for Monday, I want you to read Exodus 1 through 7:5. Exodus 1 through 7:5. Make sure you bring your Bibles.